thank you everyone for
$2
coming
on
out
YouTube.
to our speaker
What? It gets
series
better if you
event. Our speaker today needs no introduction. For those of you who have not taken a class with him, this is Professor Zamosc-Regueros, who has published numerous things on Nietzsche. And I know today he's been grappling with Nietzsche on tragedy for some time. So today, please join me in welcoming our own Professor Zamosc-Regueros on Nietzsche and tragedy.
Thank you all for coming. My idea today was not to read a paper, but to try and sort of lecture a little bit. So, as a way also to take responsibility away from whatever I'm going to say next, since I'm all making it all out as I kind of go. So don't hold me for any of this. That's a call-out. So I provided a kind of guideline. So there's a blueprint. And my hope is to speak for no more than 40 minutes, hopefully less. Most of this is quotes that I'll be referencing maybe. The guiding question that sort of is informing this talk today is this bizarre series of claims. For those of you who are familiar with Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, you would have encountered these claims. Nietzsche says at some point that art is the highest task and the truly metaphysical activity of this life, and that it's only as an aesthetic phenomenon that existence and the world are eternally justified. And so in particular, part of what I'm interested in understanding, not just these claims, just what does it mean to say that art is a metaphysical activity, is also to ask the question why or how did Nietzsche attribute to Greek tragedy this capacity to provoke some kind of metaphysical comfort? What is meant by that kind of metaphysical comfort in the audience, and what does it entail? So my main argument, the thing I'm going to argue for here, is that we need to understand these claims in a kind of subversive way, that when Nietzsche is using the word metaphysical in Birth and in subsequent works, he's using it in the early period, he's using them in a kind of ironic way, in particular to subvert Schopenhauerian metaphysics. And so I'll talk about Schopenhauer at some point, hopefully, a little bit. And that, in fact, what the metaphysical goal of art and tragedy in particular is to realize this kind of task, which is through self-knowledge to redeem nature herself from the cursed life of the animal by transfiguring nature in the form of a genuine, of what Nietzsche is going to call a genuine culture. That is to say, by beautifying the idea of humanity or the concept of humanity, or making nature more complete. Okay, so this is so if that's what metaphysics means, then it's subversive, because of course we're not going beyond nature really. We are beautifying nature, or the beyond here is meant in a different way, not in the kind of traditional metaphysical sense. Now, the more common interpretation of these claims, I provide an example of the common way usually Birth of Tragedy is interpreted. For instance, Registered recently in 2014 has written a paper where he, among the things he claims, so I'm just going to read part of the quotes that I provided. I provide two quotes from his view. These are some things he claims. The comfort tragedy provides is a metaphysical comfort, and to that extent it remains a form of diversion or disengagement, possible only in the final analysis through a kind of deception or detachment. And further down in that same essay, he's going to claim Nietzsche, referring especially to Nietzsche's self-criticism. Nietzsche, of course, later in life said, I got some things wrong in Birth of Tragedy, and the way I started out was not quite right. So he's self-critical, and referring to his self-criticism, this is what Registered claims. What disturbs Nietzsche about his own youthful enthusiasm for the tragic myth is its metaphysical character, its invitation to discount or altogether ignore this, the empirical world, in favor of a mythical, other world. And then again, in the final analysis, it passes off what is in reality a negation of life for an affirmation of it, for it still implicitly claims that the justification of our existence in this empirical world cannot be found in it and must be sought outside of it, in a world beyond or behind it, that is to say, a metaphysical world. Okay, so against this kind of reading, which I think is common and prevalent, I'm going to argue that, of course, as I just said, metaphysics should not be understood in this kind of literal way, that it's more a rhetorical device, and in fact is one in which Nietzsche is subverting his teacher, in some sense, what he was, the person he's going to call his teacher later on in life, namely Schopenhauer. And of course, it's part of this picture that I just read, Register's own idea. It goes along with a kind of intellectual picture of Nietzsche's trajectory, intellectual trajectory, in which Nietzsche began as a person who was very much enthralled by Schopenhauerian metaphysics and Schopenhauer in general, and then later on repudiated this kind of Schopenhauerian metaphysical worldview in favor of a more scientific worldview, etc. And part of what I'm calling into question here is, of course, this kind of picture of saying, in fact, Nietzsche was already engaged in a combatant, sort of hostile relationship with his teacher, with his mentor, intellectual mentor, early on, even in birth, right? That he's in fact engaging in a rhetorical kind of struggle with Schopenhauer, using Schopenhauerian terminology to subvert and sort of transform Schopenhauer's theory into its opposite, in fact. So it has a kind of ironizing, is that even a word? I don't know. Ironizing kind of twist, right? So of course, to do this, we have to talk a little bit about Schopenhauer, who's supposed to be the guiding light here. And Schopenhauer has in his book The World as Will and Representation, he has a series of essays. One of them is called On Man's Need for Metaphysics. And what Schopenhauer says there is that basically in the human being is a special sort of animal. When the human being enters the scene for Schopenhauer with his highly developed intellect, it starts reflecting on existence and on life, and he very soon discovers that existence is a mess, basically. It's just crazy, it's full of death, suffering, the futility of all endeavors, right? Whatever you desire in the end comes to nothing, right? You're gonna end up dead. And so therefore the character of existence for this intellect is essentially evil. And Schopenhauer then says this puts the human being in need of metaphysics. That is to say, in need of a form of knowledge that goes beyond the physical empirical reality that we've observed through an intellect contains this evil character, and that can somehow redeem us from this evil nature of physical life or empirical existence. Okay? So we need some kind of salvation. This is the metaphysical need. And of course, metaphysics is the knowledge that provides it. For Schopenhauer, there are really two versions of metaphysics. There's the genuine metaphysical inquiry, which is philosophy proper, and then there is the more washed out metaphysical inquiry, popular metaphysics, he calls it, which is religion. So religion is a kind of metaphoric way of capturing the metaphysical reality. Philosophy is the more cleared out way of capturing through metaphysics. In conjunction with this, for Schopenhauer, there are basically two forms metaphysical knowledge can take. You can have the kind of pessimistic knowledge, the one that says at the bottom of reality, sort of what we come to realize is the real nature of reality is such that this reality sheds a kind of light on this reality, namely it has no justification and can never be justified. Therefore, we must negate this empirical existence and retract or go back, regress back to some kind of more primordial, noumenal, metaphysical form of existence, which is prior to this physical form of existence. That is pessimistic philosophy, which in essence concludes, or metaphysics, pessimistic metaphysics, which concludes in essence that the world, the empirical world we live in, cannot be justified and must be negated. Or a more optimistic version of this metaphysics, which basically concludes, with the knowledge I gained, this metaphysical knowledge I gained, I can maybe reform the world, change it, and justify my existence. Of course, for Schopenhauer, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Schopenhauer's own view. For Schopenhauer, optimistic views, optimistic metaphysics are false or profoundly mistaken in some sense. The only genuine metaphysics, the only genuine philosophy has to be pessimistic. So it has to come to the conclusion that the empirical world, empirical reality, nature as we see it in all these forms, has to be negated. That it's a bad dream from which we have to awaken. That's his famous kind of turn of phrase. So the way he kind of plays out in his own philosophy, the way this kind of plays out is in the idea that behind the empirical world, or in the innermost essence of the empirical world, the metaphysical reality that underlies this empirical world we inhabit as human beings and as animals, and etc., lies this noumenal will, that he's going to call the will, this noumenal thing, that in fact has entered into existence, has entered into physical form, and has become a phenomenon, right? So the noumenal has transformed into a phenomenon, and it has done so blindly or chaotically. And this is why the phenomenal world that we can contemplate through our intellect has the character of evil and suffering that he thinks anybody should be able to, if they are thinking clearly, should be able to contemplate. So in a way, for Schopenhauer, the reason why existence in its empirical form is a mistake and error is because the metaphysical will, the noumenal will, has entered into this physical form by mistake, right? And so it has to redress the mistake by, in effect, negating itself in its physical form. What is that physical form? It's what Schopenhauer is going to now call the will to live, right? So all existence manifests for Schopenhauer, all physical existence manifests for Schopenhauer a will to live. Existence, nature, here we can talk now about nature. Nature itself, as physical form, appears to be pushing forth into being, okay? Making more beings out of itself continually in a process that seems never-ending, chaotic, and of course, predating on itself, feeding on itself, as it were. This is the metaphor kind of that he's going to use. And this is not just in organic life, that is to say in animal life, but also in inorganic life. So stars and things coming in and out of existence, black holes, devouring whole galaxies and what have you, okay? So for Schopenhauer, this is the will to live. In its organic form, in animal form, it takes on the further form, the further appearance, the further phenomenon of being the sex drive, as it were. So in all organic life, in all animal life, the thing that steers us forward, the thing that keeps us going, procreating into new beings, is the sex drive for him. Now, as I said, this is a kind of chaotic birth, and so therefore Schopenhauer concludes this was all a mistake, right? We should not have entered into existence. We are, of course, manifestations of this noumenal will, but this was all mistaken. We have to take a step back. How do we do that? We negate the will to live. Okay, we're going to become ascetic in some sense. Retract. Now, so this is a brief kind of characterization, obviously, caricature a little bit of Schopenhauer. You will forgive me. But the main thing I want to conclude with is, of course, Schopenhauer has a particular view about tragedy. And this goes along with his view about the Greeks in general, which he thought were an optimistic culture. And this is perhaps best exemplified in the idea that for the Greeks, or for many of the Greeks at least, right, ancient Greeks, their philosophy is, look, in essence, the human being, life should not be a suffering. You should not suffer. You should be happy, right, in life. And you can attain happiness in life if you gain the proper knowledge, metaphysical knowledge, okay, and use this knowledge to reform your life in some ways and to attain happiness. So the virtuous life is the life of the person who has knowledge, right, and proper sort of knowledge, and he should be happy. And that's an optimistic view. So obviously wrong for Schopenhauer, right? So in essence, Schopenhauer is going to say this is a wrong view. But the Greeks, however, in their highest art form, namely tragedy, came close to the truth. So this is an important point, because of course we're going to talk about Nietzsche's own view of tragedy. And so Schopenhauer, I provided a quote here. He says, "Every tragedy demands the existence of an entirely different kind, a different world, the world of which can always be given to us only indirectly. The knowledge of which can only be given to us only indirectly, as here by such a demand. At the moment of the tragic catastrophe," so the moment the tragic hero suffers his tragic fate, "we become convinced, more clearly than ever, that life is a bad dream from which we have to awake." Okay, so we have to negate life. Life is a bad dream. This is not worth living. Okay, it's not worth living. You gotta negate the will to live, and in particular, the sex drive, because this is in all animal life, this is the thing that's pushing us forth. Okay, so my claim now is that birth of tragedy, for those of you who are of course familiar with Nietzsche's arguments there, in some ways already is subverting this whole structure, right? It's subverting the structure, first because you will have noticed that in the quote I gave you at the beginning, or in the claims, I didn't actually quote, but I mentioned these claims at the beginning of tragedy, Nietzsche is already telling you that there's a third metaphysical activity, right? Schopenhauer forgot to include art as a metaphysical activity. He has talked about religion and he has talked about philosophy, but there's a third way, there's art. The artistic way is also a kind of metaphysics. So that already is a slap in the head in some ways to this whole Schopenhauerian worldview. And it becomes even more a slap in the head when we get into the arguments of the book itself. So among the most important arguments, of course, is this idea that tragedy begins in a musical chorus of satyrs, right? And that's, of course, following philological tradition that has shown us that tragedy in its beginnings was only a chorus of satyrs, and that was it. Later on, it acquired the drama as part of the structure of tragedy. That's a later addition to tragedy, but in its beginnings, tragedy begins being only a chorus. And so Nietzsche, of course, has as its task to interpret what is this chorus, what is the meaning of this chorus. And he gives you a very particular kind of meaning. The meaning of this chorus in this musical, and remember, this is a satyr. The chorus of satyrs that are playing music in some ways are in a musical mood, and they are transmitting this musical mood to the audience, right? And we are, in fact, being, as Nietzsche says, taken over by the music. We become possessed, in some sense, and here in a very kind of sexual connotation, which is already also an anti-Schopenhauerian theme, because for Schopenhauer, the thing you have to deny first is the sex drive. So nothing sexual, please, if you are Schopenhauer. Here we have a very sexual thing. You're being possessed by the music in a particular way, and this is generating a metaphysical, what Nietzsche is going to call a metaphysical comfort. How is it generating a metaphysical comfort, or in what does it consist? Well, I've given you a quote here. What the most immediate effect, Nietzsche tells us, of the chorus is that the Greek man of culture felt himself nullified in the presence of the satiric chorus. And this is the most immediate effect of the Dionysian tragedy, that the state and society, and quite generally the gulfs between man and man, give way to an overwhelming feeling of unity, leading back to the heart of nature. So in essence, what has happened in this transformation is, through the musical mood, you have forgotten your particular individuality, and in particular, the embodiment of culture that you are, of a particular civilization. You are the Greek with the mortgage and the kids and there's all this stuff, and the guy who has to go to war next. All of that is gone. You have been taken by the music. You've forgotten all of it. And in fact, you're now identifying with these creatures that represent what? Nature. They represent nature in its pristine form. The thing that lies behind all civilizations. The thing that we all, in essence, are. Natural creatures. Now, this is already also an ironic move with respect to Schopenhauer, because of course, if you're going to translate this into Schopenhauerian language, what Nietzsche is saying is basically you have to identify with nature as will to live. Okay, the satiric chorus represents the will to live of nature, and that's the thing you've been taken, that has taken you over. Here, remember, the will to live, Schopenhauer has said, takes on the further form of the sexual drive. So sex is very much in the scene here. You've identified that you've been, in some sense, possessed sexually by these beings that are nature, and you've now forgotten your civilization and all your culture, and have, in this musical mood, come to inhabit this kind of natural state, or more natural state. Nietzsche also refers to this, in this kind of embodiment, or this kind of losing yourself in the chorus, as an identification with what he's going to call the universal subject, or the primal oneness, or unity, the primal author. That is to say, nature as a kind of original or creator power, the will to live, if you want to speak Schopenhauerian. And this is important because, of course, as I'm saying, it's already a kind of reversal of Schopenhauer. This is precisely what Schopenhauer would say you cannot do. You cannot identify yourself with the will to live. That's the no-no, right? That's precisely what's wrong. If anything, knowledge should lead to the opposite. So Nietzsche is already here very much taking a very contrarian view to Schopenhauer. Now it's important that this is a chorus of satyrs for Nietzsche, because a satyr is a half human, half animal. And this means you haven't, in identifying yourself with the satyr, you haven't lost completely your humanity, it turns out. Your humanity is always there, lurking, in the very symbol that you've identified with, namely the satyr that is now playing this music in front of you. And this is important because Nietzsche signals that the comfort you get, this metaphysical comfort of uniting with nature again, is fragile, is unstable. And it's unstable because consciousness can always come in the scene again, can enter again into the form. You can remember that you're a human being, let's put it that way, again, and that is going to create, Nietzsche thinks now, a nausea, right? It's going to lead you to the kind of Schopenhauerian realization that all of this life, natural existence seems kind of crazy, okay, and without meaning and without purpose, and that you have to be a human being, and that seems already, you are in a predicament that seems bizarre and weird. And this leads to a kind of possibility that you will end up in the Schopenhauerian place, namely denying the will to live, right? Denying life and saying nothing is worth it, ending up in the kind of intoxicated state that leads to vomiting, which is, here, for those who have read, of course, the Dionysian is described in terms of the state of intoxication that you get when you're drunk, which is a very nice metaphor because, of course, intoxication, if you're really, really drunk, usually leads to nausea and vomiting, which is precisely the point that he's trying to draw. Now, this is why, in some ways, Nietzsche is going to say, tragedy has to evolve into an art form that not only has a chorus, but also has a drama. And the drama now is going to be the transfiguring thing, the transfiguring element that is going to rescue you from possible negation of the will, from possible nausea. So Apollo here comes to the rescue in this new transfiguration. The myth that gets displayed in front of you, Nietzsche says, is projected out of the chorus. So out of nature, out of this state, musical mood, you get the drama played in front of your eyes as an audience. And this brings a new kind of redemption through the myth. And now this myth, what's important about this myth, is that it represents the world of appearance, the empirical world, but in the form of the life of a hero that is going to go through its drama and its tragedy and its and so I provided a quote here. You will see that Nietzsche says, assuming that, so I'm going to read parts of it. Assuming that art is not merely imitation of the reality of nature. I'm on page 3, by the way, for those of you who might have been lost in my disquisitions here. I'm on page 3, and I'm reading on this quote here on the middle of the page, more or less. Assuming that art is not merely imitation of the reality of nature, but rather a metaphysical supplement of the reality of nature, placed beside it for its overcoming, the tragic myth too, insofar as it belongs to art at all, participates fully in this metaphysical intention of art to transfigure. But what does it transfigure when it presents the world of appearance in the image of the suffering hero? And this is an important question here. Notice the question, what is it that is being transfigured? Nietzsche is going to tell us, least of all, the reality of this world of appearance. And this is because, in a way, the myth, and this is something that I'm going to kind of skip it, but it's the next quote. He had already, in an earlier part of the book, said that the myth itself, the mythical epic that Homer invented, for instance, is a transfiguration of the world of appearances. It's a transfiguration of the life of the human being as an empirical being, let's say, or the life of yourself as a natural being. It's transfigured because, of course, it's represented now in the form of a myth, right? This is what he has said earlier. And if now this myth is being used to transfigure something, well, it can't be transfiguring this world of appearances because it already is a transfiguration of this world of appearances. The myth itself is a transfiguration of a world of appearances. Therefore, the projection of this myth out of a chorus, whatever transfiguring act it is performing, it has to be something else that is being transfigured by this transfiguration. Okay, a lot of transfigurations there. I can talk about it in question and answer to make it more clear. Now, I'm gonna claim that what gets transfigured, since it is not empirical reality itself or nature itself that gets transfigured, what I'm gonna say gets transfigured is the engine of nature. That is to say, the will to live itself, if you wish, or the mechanism, the creator power that is nature herself. Not the world of appearances that this nature has manufactured for us, in some sense, this world of empirical reality, but the thing that lies as its motor or engine, okay? The thing that is moving it. Now, of course, what is that thing? Well, if you're thinking Schopenhauer a little bit here, you're thinking it's the will itself in its manifestation as will to live, right? The will that propels creatures and nature into existence and into procreation. Okay, this is the thing that that creates the empirical reality for us. Now, what is this thing? Well, it's a kind of free creator, an author. He uses the metaphor of a primal author, a kind of artist, okay, an artistic nature, or an artist nature that is now creating empirical reality for us. So it is, in some sense, freedom itself that is being transfigured. Yeah. So my claim is that what the myth in this ensemble of chorus and drama, what the myth now is going to transfigure is the very idea of freedom itself, the engine that creates life, right, in some sense. Now, of course, this is why Nietzsche at some point is going to say that the tragic myth really exemplifies the disharmonic as a source of kind of higher pleasure, and this is a quote I provided there. The joy, so I'm going to just read part of it. It is precisely the tragic myth that has to convince us that even the ugly and disharmonic are part of an artistic game that the will, in the eternal amplitude of its pleasure, plays with itself. Only music, placed beside the world, can give us the idea of what is meant by the justification of the world as an aesthetic phenomena. The joy aroused by the tragic myth has the same origin as the joyous sensation of dissonance in music. Now, so there is this kind of idea that what the myth represents is dissonance, the dissonance that, in a sense, nature herself represents by having come into existence. So here you can think in the sort of Schopenhauerian picture that I painted earlier, the will comes into empirical existence. It does so blindly, and it does so in a way that perpetually creates new beings. Okay, we're in this process where there's a never-ending steering of creation, of being coming into the world. Now that is, in a sense, is disharmonic because the beings are displacing each other. They're in relationships of conflict with each other. So here you can think of the predatory side of nature, right? One being eats another, etc. One being has to die so that the others keep on going. This all represents a kind of disharmonic relationship. Even if nature herself is not aware of it, there is a kind of contradictory or out of harmony, disharmonic relationship in nature herself. Yeah. Now, of course, the human being himself is conscious of this dissonance, and this is why Nietzsche, in the next quote, is going to say that if we imagine dissonance become man, and what else is the human being? This dissonance, to be able to live, would need a splendid illusion that would cover dissonance with a veil of beauty. So here is a statement, I think, of the very idea that what is being transfigured is dissonance itself, or the very idea that freedom itself, the freedom that creates the dissonance, that is the dissonance, is the thing that is now being transfigured through the myth. Okay. Now, what does that mean? How do I translate all these things into something I can work with? Well, so what I'm going to say is basically that the myth is going to be, in essence, then speaking about freedom, but not the blind freedom of nature, but the freedom that is the human being, namely the conscious freedom of nature, or the manifestation of nature that can be conscious of itself, and therefore that can take on the role of being the disharmonic element, the sort of the creator of disharmony, but consciously, intentionally, with purpose, let's say. And that's the human being himself. And so, in essence, the myth really is going to talk about humanity and be a sort of symbol for humanity. And this is why the myth is going to, for Nietzsche, really represent or humanity is going to be represented in the myth in the form of a kind of nature god, Dionysus, or humankind nature god, namely Dionysus, and the myth is going to be all about Dionysus himself. So there are different manifestations of Dionysus being played in front of our eyes, which stand symbolically for ourselves in our higher form, in the form of a kind of God creature that can create the world with intention, as it were. Okay, so what ends up happening is the new metaphysical comfort that is provided by this mixture of the musical element and the Apollonian element, what Nietzsche calls the Apollonian element in Birth of Tragedy, namely the myth itself, the drama itself. The mixture of these two elements now provides a kind of comfort that really amounts to the comfort or the joy we take in human freedom itself and its effects, even its bad effects, even its tragic effects, even the suffering, the evil, the guilt it might produce in the world. So the whole point of the drama is to justify in our eyes, by providing a pleasant experience, the very element that makes us human, namely human freedom, and by endearing us, in some sense, to the task of pursuing this freedom in our cultures. When we go back after the drama is done, we've been transformed, we go back to our everyday lives with a new purpose, the purpose of fighting for human freedom itself, and enacting this human freedom in ourselves, ennobling the image we have of ourselves, aspiring to be a little bit like the god Dionysus, which was the subject of the myth and the drama that we just experienced. Okay. Now, I'm kind of running out of time, so I might want to skip a little bit. I know I kind of talked very quickly and about a lot of stuff. So I'm gonna skip Nietzsche's analysis of the two myths, the Oedipus and Prometheus myths. Again, these myths are showing for him, in some ways, through the symbol of Dionysus and the god Dionysus, they're showing, they're representing human freedom and what makes us special, let's say, special sorts of creatures, and they are justifying a kind of project for us, the project of building a higher culture, or building the beautification of the image of the concept of the human, which is one of the ways Nietzsche expresses this, I think. So what is tragedy itself? What does tragedy then represent? Well, it represents what Nietzsche is going to call a cultural institution in his Untimely Meditations, which deal with what is a genuine culture. And it's going to be the sort of institution that is supranational and suprapersonal, because a genuine culture really is a culture that speaks universal language. It inhabits this universal subjectivity that Nietzsche is speaking about, which is not nature, but human nature, let's put it that way, humankind. And so it's a kind of institution that therefore should speak to all of us. It should be accessible to all of us. It is the sort of institution that endears us to the goal of procreating the genius in ourselves, or the genius here becomes, in the Untimely Meditations, a kind of catchphrase for the free human being, the human being who is free. Okay? And it does so, this kind of institution endears us to the project of procreating the genius in ourselves by generating a kind of pleasure in human freedom, including its ugly aspects, including the tragical aspects of human freedom. And so that's the real meaning of tragedy. You will notice that therefore tragedy ends in a different note from the one that Schopenhauer wanted to extract from it, right? It's not the negation of life, but it's actually the affirmation of life. What life? Human life, the life of the human being, but in a kind of ennobled, idealized form, right? The life that aspires to making the human being into a kind of godlike creature, a godlike nature that can be creator of the world. Which world? The cultural world in particular, right? The world of genuine cultures. And so metaphysical here has a kind of subversive, again, element. What are we talking about? We're talking about ennoblement, the raising up, the sort of the raising up of physical humanity, right? You as a human being, in some sense, you partake of nature. You are part of the animal world, but you are this special sort of nature. You are a dissonant nature, dissonant with yourself and with nature herself. And so I provided this kind of, to kind of capture this idea a little bit, I provided this comic strip from my youth. It's in Spanish, that I can translate it to you. This is from a famous Argentinian caricaturist, Kino, and people in Latin America, we love Kino. He has this character, Mafalda, who is a girl, and this girl has some friends, and they get into philosophical discussions. In this case, one of Mafalda's friends is saying, looking at a turtle, and then starts to reflect and says, what does a turtle have to do to live? Be a turtle. What does a cat have to do to live? Be a cat. What does a bear have to do to live? Be a bear. What does a guy have to do to live? He has to be either a bricklayer, a lawyer, a turner operator, a clerk, or what have you. And then he says, in desperation, why is it that us humans have to get stuck with playing the stupid role of being superior animals, right? So this kind of idea that the problem of the human being in some sense is that he's never at home in nature, that he can't just be nature, he's reflective, and therefore he has the project, he has a predicament, right? Life is a kind of predicament for us. We have to make a life. We can't just be squirrels, okay, running around, although some of us wish we could. And of course, this is the task of tragedy in some sense, is to get you to see that there is joy in this, that there can be joy in this, even if it's also tragic and is going to make you suffer. If you devote yourself to the ennoblement of humanity, to the project of ennobling the human being, then you can find satisfaction. You can make a life that is worth living, in some sense. Now, the last thing I'm going to say that I provided, I want to stop because I want to kind of open it for questions, which I bet there are many because I went very fast over a lot of complicated arguments, is that you can see confirmation of the kind of reading that I'm pushing here in the Untimely Meditations. So I provided a quote here that I think nicely captures some of the things I just said. I'm just going to read part of it. Starting with the first bold part. The individual must be consecrated to something higher than himself. That is the meaning of tragedy. He must be free of the terrible anxiety which death and time evoke in the individual. For at any moment, in the briefest atom of life's course, he may encounter something holy that endlessly outweighs all his struggle and all his distress. This is what it means to have a sense for the tragic. All the ennoblement of mankind is enclosed in this supreme task. And then further down, this joy is altogether universal. The tragic idea has been born again. This joy is altogether universal and suprapersonal. The rejoicing of mankind at the guarantee of the unity and continuance of the human as such. So my claim is that this is precisely what tragedy for the early Nietzsche, what Greek tragedy accomplished, was precisely this kind of universal and suprapersonal rejoicing at the goal of ennobling mankind. That's all. Thanks.
So we do have time for questions and discussion.
That was like a drop. Yes.
So, can you explain more about the negate the will to live?
Yeah, from Schopenhauer's perspective. Yeah. So again, Schopenhauer thinks the will to live is just basically nature exploding into its multifarious forms of beings. Okay. Its empirical reality is the natural world. Now, because it's a kind of chaotic, this will in its natural form is chaotic, it's blind, it's not thinking, right? It does what we see, namely, creates a universe that is constantly being destroyed, that's feeding on itself, that it's going to end up in death, and even the whole universe is going to end up in death, as far as we know, right? Our scientists are telling us, either because it will implode on itself or because it's going to fall apart so much that everything is going to be cold and dead, okay, at some point. So this thing is crazy in some sense from a Schopenhauerian point of view. Now, of course, nature is blind, doesn't know it, but nature employs in the animal the will to live, becomes somewhat conscious. It develops mind of sorts, right? In animal life, it has this. Most animals, for Schopenhauer, have this thing called the intellect, but the intellect in all animal life is basically a slave to the will to live, to the procreative drive, let's say, to the sex drive. So for all animals, if you're thinking what animals are doing, they're using their intellect to get the food that's going to get them laid, that is, and then get them, to procreate. That's all they're doing. We are animals too, but in us, the intellect for Schopenhauer has developed to a higher place than the animal. It can liberate itself. It can stop being a slave of the will to live. It can stop being a slave of this procreative drive of nature. Yeah? And it can reflect on nature. You can think about where it finds itself and what's going on around it. And what it sees is what I just described. Namely, nature seems to be pushing forth into being in a crazy way, okay? And in the most insane way. And in fact, we now know stuff through our intellect that, most animals don't know. Namely that most species of animals, in fact, have disappeared from the earth already, right? Because there's been billions of years of evolution of animal life. All of those species are gone, yeah? So it's all crazy. What was it for? The intellect says, Schopenhauer thinks that the clear-minded intellect, the intellect of the proper philosopher, of the right philosophical sort, should conclude this is all insane. Yeah, this is for nothing. It's crazy, and here I am struggling with my mortgage and all these worries I have in life. It's all going to come to nothing. What the hell am I doing? Withdraw from life, negate life. The only thing I can do, realizing this, the sort of iniquity of existence, is to kind of withdraw from existence, to stop being the servant of the will to live, and in fact negate the will to live. More than not only stop being a servant, but rebel against it, right? Become a kind of enemy of the will to live. And I do that by negating my own drives, and in particular my sex drive, right? So this is kind of the Schopenhauerian story. That's how you get it. So negation of life. Yeah. And of course he thinks that's the cleared eye philosophy, right? Of course. Philosophy has to be pessimistic, right? He has to realize that existence, this world we live in, has no justification and can never have a justification. And it's all going to end up in nothing. And therefore it should be denied. It was all a mistake. Life is a dream, but it's a bad dream. It's a nightmare that you need to awaken from. That's Schopenhauer. And if you see, I don't know if we have Schopenhauer here, he was a grumpy old man. So which you can tell from his philosophy. Yes. Yes.
So, in Schopenhauer's will of representation, he actually does start off with a turtle, but I think he paints like this picture of this turtle walking down like
Yes.
the island of Java, and these whales come rip it apart.
Yes. As it lays its eggs, in fact.
Yeah, and what I got was like Schopenhauer's interpretation was like, how do we as humans interpret that pain of that turtle?
Yeah.
Are we compassionate, malicious,
Yes.
or egotistical?
Yeah.
Right. And then he says, when that is our actual working of the will, was those three, compassionate, egotistical, maliciousness.
Yeah.
And we can repose our will through aesthetics, art, and philosophy.
Yes.
Right. So what I got from this lecture is like Nietzsche. He in a certain way is saying that when we like hop into this dissonance, this Dionysian, it's like kind of like this relationship towards like the Apollonian. Like we're sitting on the side of dissonance.
Yeah.
Right. But Heidegger in his volumes on Nietzsche,
Yeah.
which is like right there, I think like chapter 6 or 7 on volume 1, he says there's a misinterpretation of the doctrine of art or beauty between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche.
Yeah.
And it seems like what Heidegger was claiming was that both with Schopenhauer and Nietzsche is that there's reposing a will, but Heidegger was claiming that the state of art is actually separate from, you know, your A, will, or B, reposing from the will, or B, the Apollinean, or just shifting from one side of the Apollinean towards the distance of the you know, just shifting from one view to the other view. But is art itself like a totally separate metaphysical dimension of like what Heidegger says, like, you know, we are like doing our stuff in a state of art, but regardless of if we repose our will in it or the will of it, there's still that state of art that's outside of us.
Yeah, I mean, from what I remember, you might be more familiar with this than I am. From what I remember from Schopenhauer, for Schopenhauer, art, I mean, there is an important role art plays in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Art can help you negate the will to live, right? And one of the ways in which it can do so is because in artistic contemplation, when you contemplate a work of art, you are in some ways detaching yourself from everyday life, right? Otherwise, you're not really contemplating art. If you're thinking about your mortgage as you're looking at the painting, you're not looking at the painting, right? So if you're looking at the painting, you've abstracted yourself from everyday living. And that's already to be a step in the right direction, to be in the step that is going to put you in the negating mood, negating the life, the will to live, right? So art has an important function to play. I'm not sure if he would call it a metaphysical function in the way Nietzsche is doing. And you know, I'm not as familiar as you seem to be with the Heidegger reading, so I can't, you know, I don't want to comment on that. But so the key aspect for me, though, is that Nietzsche thinks there is an activity that he wants to call metaphysical, right? That art is performing for us. But what is that metaphysical activity? What I've tried to argue is it's not the withdrawal from the world, in fact, that Schopenhauer is thinking art does for us, but it's the opposite. It's the injecting you into the world, but with a renewed sense of purpose, if you wish, right? With the purpose of going beyond your animalistic existence and living a kind of ennobled human existence, which is manifested in the project of creating genuine culture, which is, of course, a topic of its own. I haven't really said what that means exactly, but I think that's the function art plays for Nietzsche. And so metaphysics here is, of course, being used in a kind of ironic way, because it is a beyond the physical. Yeah, it's a metaphysical, but it's a beyond by elevating the physical. That is to say, using the physical, manipulating it in a particular way to create this civilization, yeah, with cultures and things like that. So it's a twist.
Yeah, I actually noticed, like, I actually went to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam once, and every time I see a new person that tries to do Van Gogh, it kind of like gets me upset, because like this is like, it doesn't compare to Van Gogh, you know. So it's almost like this Platonic thing, like the minis, like when you perform art, you should make it for everybody. If not, you kind of get like this kind of this guilty resentment that Nietzsche kind of describes in, like, you know,
yeah,
Essay 2 or something, you know, the genealogy.
Yeah, art has a kind of for Nietzsche, and this is why later on he's going to say we've kind of come to art in the wrong way, because we think of art from a contemplative point of view, looking at art. But it's really about creating, right? Art is more about the creating part. And so really, art should make you want to create in some sense, right? Art, the encounter with art is not contemplative, it's not passive in the way Schopenhauer is describing. It's in fact, if it's right for Nietzsche, it should make you want to live, right? To inject yourself into the world, to sort of propel yourself forward. Yes.
I have an extremely basic question.
Yes.
So we started off right off the bat with this phrase, metaphysical comfort.
Yes.
I find that just confused. I don't know what this is.
Yeah.
Particularly, like what is the adjective doing there? Metaphysical. For example, like in the various quotes, it seems like you could delete metaphysical.
Yeah.
And the sentence never changed. The comfort, which I am suggesting even now every strategy, delete, or
Yeah.
you know, a metaphysical supplement, just say a supplement of reality, the metaphysical intention, just the intention of art. So I guess I'm just not sure what is
metaphysical doing? Well,
Yeah.
it's doing a rhetorical function. Yeah. So this is what's been my claim. The claim is it's doing a rhetorical function. The rhetorical function of setting Nietzsche's arguments in opposition to Schopenhauer, slapping Schopenhauer over the head and in the bald spot preferably, and then turning him upside down, right? And saying, you are full of it, you idiot, right? That kind of thing. And so that's my reading. So metaphysical, and of course, but what does the rhetorical thing translate into then? What is the difference between metaphysical comfort and comfort? Why call it metaphysical? Well, partly because the comfort you're gaining is it's a comfort beyond your life, right? Right now, what is your life? Your real life. Your real life is I'm the guy who has the mortgage, who has the kids, who has the thing, who has to come to this job and to give it a job talk, with all these things. Okay, this is my real life. How do I get comfort from this real life? Not through real life, right? That's just more real life. I get a different life, or a different aspect, a different way of existing. What this artistic experience I'm getting?
Yeah.
In this case, the experience of being in a theater with the horse shape and looking over the nature and all that stuff, and having these guys play music and then perform a drama in front of my eyes. That experience, it's kind of metaphysical because my empirical physical existence has been left behind, right? If I brought it in, then I'm not having that experience and I'm not comforted, in fact. It's the opposite, right? I'm still thinking of my freaking mortgage, right? And I can't enjoy the performance. I'm worrying about life, yeah? And that's empirical life, physical life, yeah? But I need a metaphysical, now of course here in a subversive, ironic, metaphoric sense, right? Because the theater, after all, is physical life, right? I mean, I haven't abandoned physical life, really, right? I'm still in physical life, but it's art, yeah? And art, therefore, is metaphysical, right? It goes beyond the physical, natural life. It gives me an artificial life, right? A kind of artistic life, right? And that's the point. So in that sense, it's a metaphysical comfort, not just a comfort. Yeah? And it's what makes the difference between comforting myself by drinking, physical life, right? Or taking drugs, or doing something else, and comforting myself by having an artistic experience. So this is, the early Nietzsche thinks art is crucial. Without art, you wouldn't want to live, basically. Or you would have to comfort yourself by intoxicating yourself, living like an animal, dumbing yourself like an animal, and becoming animal. Yeah. But you are not an animal. You're more than an animal. You have the problem the comic strip is talking about. You have to figure out how to live. You can't do what the squirrel does. Be a squirrel, right? Now you have to be a human, but what is that? Oh, now I have a problem. What is it to be a human? Is it this mortgage? Is it having these kids? Is it doing all these things, or is it something else? And the idea is, it better be something else, because otherwise you might end up in kind of nihilistic negation of life, right? You might end up in saying, no, it's not worth it. What is this all? What was it all for? In the end, here I am, paying this mortgage. I finally pay it, and I die the next day. What the hell? What was that for? Right? Kind of like this idea, right? Is that going to give meaning to my life? Maybe not, right? So what would this kind of artistic project, Nietzsche thinks, at least early Nietzsche thinks? Yes?
As you think of this question, as the emphasis, I guess, especially for Schopenhauer, because Nietzsche seems to be responding to Schopenhauer.
Yes.
And this, I guess, is why the Greeks? Or maybe to put it another way, could this conversation have happened? Same conversation, could that have happened with current
Yes,
theater?
I think so. Although, so it's important that part of Birth of Tragedy, I mean, the birth of tragedy is really about the birth of tragedy, the death of tragedy, and the rebirth of tragedy in a very kind of Dionysian way, right? And the rebirth of tragedy is Wagnerian opera, Nietzsche thinks, at this point, right? The Wagnerian opera, the contemporary Wagnerian movement, that might be the rebirth of this tragical thing. Wagner might end up doing the same thing. In fact, he very, very quickly, in fact, I think, maybe even as he's writing this book, he realizes that's not quite true, right? That the Wagnerian opera, in fact, represents false art. It represents a kind of escapism, the kind of numbing art, the art that is more like drinking, an art that just has effects that are meant to dull you, to sort of not put you in touch with this kind of project, but actually take you away from it. So there is a way in which you can talk about contemporary art, yes, for Nietzsche, and ask the question: is contemporary art performing this kind of metaphysical activity, or is it actually performing it badly, or taking us away from the activity itself, right? Is it doing something that is not really proper art, right? So I think you can ask that question, yeah.
It's contradictory almost.
What is?
So it's like if you go for art,
Yes,
right, to use it to escape or to have that life outside of this life,
yes,
he criticizes like religion as the same thing,
that's right, yeah.
right? Because sorry,
Yeah.
since so from the very first, Christianity was essentially in the nausea and surfeit of life for life, which only disguised, concealed, and decked itself out under the belief in another or better life.
Right, yeah.
So
So
it's
they-
like what's like doing trading for one.
So you mean proper metaphysics versus this kind of false metaphysics? Yeah, so the proper metaphysics is the one for Nietzsche that should inject you back into life more emphatically. The other metaphysics is the one that is escape from life, or a kind of denial of life, or a withdrawal from life. But to inject yourself back to life, not as a physical life, not as an animal life, not as a kind of just mere human being, but to ennoble, to raise yourself higher. Right? So that's part of the message here, right? Proper art is the one that injects you back into life, but with the task, not the task to just live an animal life as comfortably as you can, maximize your pleasures or whatever, pay the freaking mortgage finally, right? Or whatever you. No, the life that it has a project that reaches beyond your own egoistic self, and that is in fact universal, right? This universal subjectivity, this faith in humanity, as it were, right? That embellishes the concept human, the life that sort of can embellish the concept of the human being, can ennoble it. Yeah. Yes.
So I feel conflicted about this because I think Schopenhauer got a lot of things right, but then joy and freedom sound good. So I think I'm curious to see how we go from dissonance
Yes.
to joy and human freedom, and
Well,
how art
yeah.
functions there, right? Like,
Yeah.
because I think dissonance is
Obviously,
sort of
yeah.
the common ground between maybe Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. I think
Yes.
they both see that conflicted nature of humans,
Yes.
right? But then, how do we find freedom in this dissonance?
Or how do we find pleasure in the ugly? This is and this is, by the way, a very current problem in tragedy. Tragedy, after all, shows us, a human being committing incest and then, having children with his mother and tearing his eyes out. I mean, this is all very horrible, right? Horrendous things. How can you have joy in this, right? How can you like that? That's a very puzzling thing in some ways, right? Now, Nietzsche's answer to that is because there's music to it. That seems to be that's basically the answer in a nutshell, right? You are in this musical mood, right? There's music. You've been taken out of your own self and you've been possessed by the music. This is why he thinks the birth of tragedy out of the spirit of music, and the music is very important. This is why it's a key element of his argument. I've been possessed by the music, so I'm already in a joyous state. The music itself generates joy. And then out of this joyous state, I get this message transmitted to me. And the message is, look at this human being, godlike thing, right? Dionysus, in the form now of a hero, Oedipus, right, for instance. And look how he's dismembered, torn apart, but he does great things too. He rescues people from the Sphinx, right? And the curse of the Sphinx. Oh, that's amazing. He kind of does all these wonderful things, and he suffers horribly too, right? Terrible that he suffered, but I can now kind of reconcile myself to that. I can be okay with that. I can I feel joy nonetheless, right? Why? Well, is it because I only focus on the good? No, I also have seen the bad, right? So I've taken all together. But the whole spectacle, overall, is joyful for me. And it's partly maybe out of a trick, because I'm already in a good mood, a musical mood, right? And therefore, perceiving this as only tragic or horrible, yeah, or ugly. So that's why the pleasure in dissonance. So this is why dissonance is important, and why dissonance, in some sense, is a symbol now for the human being himself. The human being is dissonant, right? Exists in a dissonant state, as I just mentioned in the comic that you see, right? You are in a dissonant state because you don't know how to live. In some sense, you are out of touch, not, but out of harmony with nature, right? You're not like a squirrel, right? And that's unfortunate in some sense, right? It's ugly, but you could get joy too out of it. Yeah. If only I had the right art form that is going to make you feel joy for that.
I have a quick follow-up then,
Yeah.
Because then metaphysical need for Schopenhauer,
Yes.
you said, is the need for salvation
Yes.
from this existence.
Yes.
Then would you say Nietzsche still believes that there is metaphysical need?
In
or
some
is he
sense, yes,
negating
right?
it?
But he's subverting it. So in some sense,
Okay.
yes. The sense that is yes, I think, is that Nietzsche thinks we need kind of redemption. We need a sort of redemption from physical everyday existence, right? And the redemption, though, unlike Schopenhauer, is not metaphysical in the strict sense, because the redemption is culture, right? Genuine culture, art, which is a physical manifestation, of course, but it's not quite a physical manifestation, or it's a weird physical manifestation because it's a nature that has been embellished. Let's put it that way, right? It has been forced to wear makeup, right? You are the squirrel who wears makeup, right? Which is kind of weird, right? You're a weird squirrel, and that means that's what allows Nietzsche to play with the word, right? Metaphysical. You are kind of above nature a little bit. You're out of harmony with nature by way of being always thrown beyond it already, right? Beyond nature, but in the Schopenhauerian way, that is to say, reaching for something that is in some other nature, in some other way, or beyond nature by reaching into nature itself and making it different, right? Changing it. And that's cool. Yes.
On the note of, I don't know your name, but it has two speakers, with the difference between religious redemption or saving and the art of tragedy or the tragic art.
Yeah.
Would it be something, I think you mentioned before in the class about the weakness he viewed with somebody else redeeming you, as opposed to the strength of us giving it to the gods,
Right.
doing it ourselves and finding our own redemption?
Yes, so part of the redemption is to take this kind of combative culture means, part of the way culture is metaphysical too, and it's the part you're emphasizing, and it's also part of the message of tragedy, right, as Nietzsche sees it, is being in opposition to nature, taking a kind of contrarian stance towards nature. This is part of the dissonance, right? You're dissonant because you don't want to live like a squirrel, right? You don't just want to answer the question how to be a human by saying, do whatever your natural instincts tell you to do and go for it, right? No, you want to kind of take a combative stance towards nature. Part of it is to extract knowledge from nature, for instance, which Nietzsche kind of describes, and this is in the quotes that I didn't read on the page 4, right, where he's reading the myths and telling you what these myths are about a little bit. And you will notice that in these myths, he says things like, how else could one compel nature to surrender her secrets, if not by triumphantly resisting her, right? That is, by means of something unnatural. So part of what the Oedipus myth is about human freedom, partly because it's about how human freedom is about wrestling with nature, right? Kind of having this kind of combative relationship with natural existence, right? And that's the thing that allows you to raise yourself above natural existence. Yeah. Part of it is science, part of it is knowledge, and knowledge that you have to pay for by means of suffering, right? So you suffer partly because you are the knowing creature. You're the creature. You're the squirrel who decided to do science so that he could build these kinds of things, right? Like the room we're in right now, and therefore you have to suffer for it. Yeah, in some sense, you pay the price.
But willingly.
But willingly, yes. Tragedy, the message is, I'm willing to pay the price. Yeah, because awesome. Yeah, yay, I want to be like the god Dionysus, become man. Maybe Oedipus or Prometheus or whatever.
Is that why he saw Christianity as like a weakness?
And Christianity would be the
You're
opposite
just
message, yes.
saying, say, you're waiting for a savior or somebody to redeem.
Well, yeah, not only you're waiting for a savior, but your salvation is about withdraw from life. Yeah, this empirical world is crazy.
And from a
Right.
nihilism.
Yes.
So,
So there's multiple levels of discussion here. Obviously,
Yes.
that might be a no-doubt explanation, but it seems like, at least starting-wise, you are going against a common interpretation here
Yes.
with register as the
One
example.
target, yeah.
It seems like, given the examples, like you're demonstrating or that might be a correct word, but some consistency with that. Your point is consistent with the wording he uses, and as well as it seems across multiple texts,
Yes.
the meditations and the birth of
Tragedy.
tragedy. I guess could you give a brief expo on where this the common interpretations come from?
I think they come from, well, first of all, that, I try to do a job of interpreting these claims, but as you might have noticed from the claims themselves, they're pretty obscure claims, right? I mean, to talk about a metaphysical activity, what the hell does he mean? To make all these other, so if you look through these quotes, this is not self-evident, I don't think. It requires work, right? To try to figure out what the hell might be Nietzsche thinking here. So that's one thing. It's not self-evident, first of all, right? Which means you might get it wrong, right? Or it's easy to get it wrong if it's not so self-evident. And the other one is that there is a kind of common view that is not altogether mistaken about Nietzsche's intellectual trajectory. Namely, Nietzsche begins in a very kind of, Nietzsche is enamored of Schopenhauer in some sense, right? He's like Schopenhauerian a la lettre, right? He's kind of like, yes, I want to be Schopenhauerian. Schopenhauer got the truth. I converted to Schopenhauerianism or something like that, right? And this is not without. I mean, there are places where Nietzsche speaks very enthusiastically about having discovered Schopenhauer and things like that in his letters and things. So it's not without reason that you get this picture, right? But what the picture kind of omits or doesn't see is that Nietzsche was never just, a kind of devotee of Schopenhauer. He was always, as he was in life, in some sense, he was always very active reader, active interpreter. He was never a person who just bought a story or something like that. He was a person who was trying to think through things and construct his own views of things, right? And so the same is true with Schopenhauer. The same is true with science later when he, becomes enamored with science, as some people think that he does. But it's never an attitude of just surrender, right, to the thing. That would be very un-Nietzschean in some sense. It's the opposite attitude. It's the attitude of I'm an active learner who isn't just going to swallow whole whatever Schopenhauer is telling me, but it's going to be in a kind of more combative relationship with this thing, right? That doesn't prevent me from seeing it as very supremely valuable and as seeing certain truths in it. For instance, as we said, the pessimistic world of worldview, right? Namely, life itself. We should be clear-eyed about life. Life is suffering, evil, terrible, wicked in many ways. The question is, can we find a way of also, living and affirming life, or should we end up where Schopenhauer ends up? Namely, we have to deny life. Yeah, that's more the question. So I think there are reasons why people can get caught up with this reading and why it makes sense. Some are textual, when he talks about the primal unity, that sounds a lot like Schopenhauer's noumenal will, for instance, right? But if you pay attention, I think, as I've tried to emphasize, the primal unity has to be understood as the will to live, or nature, right? Nature herself as creator, or something like that. So it's not really the noumenal will, it's the phenomenal will, or the will in its phenomenal natural manifestation, right? The manifestation of the world as representation, as Schopenhauer would put. Yeah.
So just see if I'm catching it correctly. It seems like they see a stronger connection, or at least part of the puzzle is that they see a stronger connection with Schopenhauer.
That's right.
So they read a lot of that
worldview. Yeah.
into it.
Yes, that's correct.
Well, we can continue the discussion over the refreshment table. Let's thank our speaker for this.